Hello and welcome to the Civil Service World podcast. I'm Jess Bowie, Editor-in-Chief of Civil Service World. I'm recording this on the morning of Friday the 13th of February. Yesterday, at about 5 p.m, the government announced that the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Chris Wormald, would be stepping down with immediate effect from a post he had held for just 13 months. A few hours earlier, I recorded a discussion with my co-editor-in-chief and job share, Suzannah Brecknell, and Hannah Keenan, Associate Director of the Institute for Government and former civil servant. We explored the impact on the civil service of a week's worth of media speculation and hostile briefings, and the wider implications of the dismissal of a Cabinet Secretary a year after he was appointed by the same Prime Minister. The situation moved on after we recorded, but the whole discussion remains relevant and captures a moment of great significance in the civil service's relationship with this government. So here it is. I began the conversation by asking my job share, Suzannah, to explain the situation up to that point yesterday afternoon.
The extraordinary thing that we've been following this week, and as you say, it feels very fast-moving in a way that someone who reports on Whitehall is not used to. What we've seen at the beginning of the week, really strong briefings that the Cabinet Secretary was about to be sacked as part of the fallout from the Mandelson-Epstein scandal. Through the week, we have not had any kind of denial or confirmation about those briefings. We've had strong speculation, in fact, about who is going to follow Chris Wormald as Cabinet Secretary, and even to the point where in the last half hour, we've heard from the number 10 lobby briefing that the Prime Minister's spokesperson is saying that the Cabinet Office is being overseen by a Cabinet Secretary, but refusing to name who that Cabinet Secretary is. So it's just extraordinary on many levels that I think we will get into.
It feels unprecedented, certainly in my 12 years of covering this, and I'm sure your 15 years of covering Cabinet Secretaries. This does feel like uncharted territory. Hannah, I'd love to get the sort of IFG view on what's been happening this week, and also your general reflection on Sir Chris Wormald's tenure as Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, I think as you both say, it's extraordinary, unprecedented words that we have had to use far too often in the past few years. Just Suzannah, on your point about, 500,000 civil servants not knowing who is necessarily leading them at this point in time. Of course, the civil service is incredibly professional. The people in the heart of the Cabinet Office are incredibly professional. They will find their way to work through this. But it is a very uncomfortable position for very many people to be in right now. And I don't think they can... ministers and the Prime Minister can't really let this drag on for a hugely long time. Yeah,
things are going to grind to even more of a halt than they already have done, aren't they?
So, probably, right? There's stuff that will keep moving through the system, but there is some stuff that does need a Cabinet Secretary, the Cabinet Secretary, to opine on. And I think crucially also, that role is one of an advisor. It's one that doesn't necessarily have a lot of kind of levers of control over other permanent secretaries and bits of the department. It's one that is dependent on personal authority, and how you keep that if the Prime Minister's spokesperson can't tell you that it's you who is the Cabinet Secretary, I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I think also before we think about Chris's time so far as Cabinet Secretary, I think the other point that is so extraordinary is that he has only been Cabinet Secretary for a year. It's 14 months since he was appointed and just over 13 since he began. I mean, tenure of Cabinet
by the Prime Minister Starmer as the man to rewire the state.
It's quite usual for Cabinet Secretaries to move after an election. We saw Simon Case moving within a year of Starmer coming to power, but for a Prime Minister to pick and then dismiss a Cabinet Secretary within a year, even if it were a permanent secretary, it would feel quite extraordinary. And there's a lovely IFG chart that shows the tenure of Cabinet Secretaries has been decreasing over the years, but it still probably averages out 5 to 10 years over the 110 years that we've had a Cabinet Secretary. So within a year, you're going to get rid of the man you thought 13 months ago was the best one for the job. What does that say about the role of the Cabinet Secretary and how permanent it is, and by extension, the role of the civil service and the kind of permanence that they can expect in their jobs?
It's really damaging for the role of Cabinet Secretary that Wormald is leaving as the fallout from the Mandelson-Epstein scandal. That is a political scandal, and there's a problem if your post of Cabinet Secretary becomes kind of more ephemeral, less substantial, less robust. What you can't have is a Cabinet Secretary who sort of says yes to everything that ministers want because they are worried about losing their roles.
Yeah, and I think the briefings against Wormald began in October last year, so less than a year after he started in post. Those briefings, we still criticised them at the time because we always criticise when officials are publicly criticised and they can't defend themselves. But those were, at least, I'm doing air quotes, in reference to Chris's sort of tenure as an official. It was around the findings of the COVID inquiry. So those briefings were about Chris as an official and his responsibilities to look after a department and to be responsible for its capability. But as you say, for him to be the kind of fallout from a political scandal and to be wrapped up into that kind of well-worn path of a prime minister fighting for their career, sacks their advisors, it really shifts, as you say, what the perception is of the cabinet secretary role. And I worry about kind of the dampening effect then on the rest of the civil service. As you say, do you feel, I can't now speak out, I can't now say no to my ministers? Because if even the cabinet secretary isn't safe from this kind of behaviour, then who is?
It also all comes back ultimately to a question of Starmer's judgment. He is the person who appointed Chris Wormald as the cabinet secretary to rewire the state. That was Starmer's decision. And I think you could look at judgment of Starmer's appointments recently, or you can look forward and say, well, what are the things that Starmer needs to exercise his judgment over now? There's a route through this that reestablishes the credibility of a cabinet secretary through Starmer's next pick that he then sticks with. Mm-hmm. And that means picking someone who will, I think, challenge Starmer and the government to really do some of that rewiring that he originally asked Chris Wormald to do.
I think now seems like a good moment to ask you both to reflect. How would you characterise his time at the top of the civil service?
I mean, the first thing to say is that by all accounts, Chris Wormald is an extraordinary civil servant and has an outstanding policy brain and is very effective, is a very good, kind person. And that is what you hear again and again. You don't get to be cabinet secretary unless you have lots of those qualities, I think. From our perspective at the Institute for Government, we're looking at to what extent has that cabinet secretary done what was asked of him of trying to rewire the state. We put out a report in January only, which now feels like a lifetime ago, looking at how the civil service changed over 2025, to what extent it met that desire to rewire, and found that actually all of the trends, broadly speaking, the negative trends in the civil service had continued in the workforce. You still had high churn, you still had a growing civil service, you still don't have a strategic workforce plan. And on things like that, I think you can say that Chris Wormald has failed at rewiring the state. Now, you can't put that entirely at his door. You also have to ask what plan are Starmer and Darren Jones and other ministers setting out to do that. But that is a joint responsibility. The other thing that I think we haven't seen that we would like to is Chris Wormald being a visible leader to the civil servants that he leads. And that change programme that they're looking for, it's both structural, which I don't think we've yet seen, but it's also sort of emotional, and it's been able to actually get at and speak directly to those 500,000 civil servants that you lead.
To echo your point there around, you can critique Wormald as a cabinet secretary, but ultimately cabinet secretary can't be more radical than their prime minister. They can't, Starmer did set out that priority of let's rewire the state. But as you say, what then followed from that? Did we see details of that?
We saw the missions, don't forget.
We saw them wither on the vine.
Hollow laugh.
So defenders of Wormald would say he didn't have a clear priority from the prime minister in actuality. There's warm words. But the thing I've always said about civil servants, their nose for understanding what the real priorities of a minister are and delivering on those is fabulous. So whatever is said in the speech versus actually, I know what my minister really wants. And so as even the cabinet secretary, for all the importance and gravitas of the role, they can go only as far as they get a mandate for. Yes, they could push for more of a mandate. They can advise to be more radical. They don't, in our current setup, have a complete free hand. So, that's not to disagree with the point around visible leadership or the need for change, but it's kind of to say he's constrained by the political environment he's in.
I think that's exactly right. I suppose I might want to test a bit about whether you can have a cabinet secretary that certainly on the management of the civil service is more radical than the prime minister and sort of, as you say, pushes that boundary and that envelope of what is possible. The civil service is really in quite an existential place at the moment, I think, and in need of that radical set of ideas and change, and that needs to come, I would posit, as much from the cabinet secretary as it is sort of then being met by ministers and the prime minister and supported by them.
Could I also pick up on this question of the process of appointing a successor if they confirm that Wormald is going to depart? You have been correcting people, you as an institution and you as an individual, that he doesn't have to follow this kind of, right, we've got to go back to the last 4 people. Tell us more about that.
So Starmer has a huge amount of flexibility in terms of who he appoints as a cabinet secretary, which is a polite way of saying he can appoint pretty much whoever he wants. It's prime ministerial prerogative. They can say, well, I want this person to be cabinet secretary. There is a small paragraph of the cabinet manual for anyone who's really interested that says, hopefully your listeners, that says that he should do it on the advice of the outgoing cabinet secretary and the first Civil Service Commissioner, Sir Chris Stewart. But they can essentially do what they want. So yeah, you could go back to the most recently run process in the shortlist there, which is Antonia Romeo, Ollie Robbins, Tamara Finkelstein, who's now left government, I think were the others on the shortlist.
Yep.
You could do that, but you could do something entirely different. And actually, the Civil Service Commission could run an open process very quickly. There's not really a time constraint in doing that.
Yeah, as you say, it's basically up to him how he decides to choose the next cabinet secretary if the vacancy arises. Do you have a sense on organisationally, or for the benefit of the civil service, what do you think the balance between a big process and legitimacy versus is chaos at the moment and we need a cabinet secretary?
I mean, there's obviously an issue of speed, isn't there? Especially given what we heard from the on the lobby briefing and certainty. They absolutely need to get the right person. If the wrong judgment is made again this time because they have rushed the process, that damages the post of cabinet secretary even further. And I really don't think they can risk doing that. So perhaps they put in something interim in the middle. Perhaps they say, we're just going to take 3 weeks to figure this out. But I think what they really need to be doing is looking forward to what are the qualities that they need out of that next cabinet secretary, and then figuring out what process they need to run to find someone with those qualities.
The thing that always strikes me about Keir Starmer's handling of, right back to the days of Sue Gray, but now over Chris Wormald and allowing all this speculation, is that this is someone, our Prime Minister is someone who sat around the Permanent Secretary's table himself when he was Director of Public Prosecutions. He's been a senior civil servant, and you would think that that would give him more of a kind of understanding of how to treat these people and these institutions, but it just hasn't played out like that, has it?
I mean, I do wonder whether part of this is a combination of Starmer wanting to follow some process and then not quite knowing how to handle that in terms of kind of timing of talking to Chris Wormald or to the other permanent secretaries, or wanting to make sure that everything's in line. But you're right, where it's kind of bashed up against the political messaging, it's left a lot of civil servants and individuals in really quite horrible positions.
We're almost out of time, but just before we wrap up, Hannah, how can we re-legitimise the role of Cabinet Secretary? What qualities do we need to see in the next incumbent, for example?
As we spoke about earlier, there's this risk that with Chris Wormald losing his role as part of a kind of political fallout, that role of Cabinet Secretary gets, as you say, delegitimised. The next person coming in, again, depending on Starmer's judgment, has the chance to turn that around. That relies on, I think, 2 things. One is not just re-legitimising the role, but doing so through re-legitimising the place that the civil service has in our constitution, in our government. And that, ultimately, I think too many ministers have lost trust and confidence that the civil service can serve them properly. And so tackling that involves 2 things. It involves actually setting out a plan for how you get under the skin of some of these structural things that we've spoken about. And it involves a culture shift, which means being a visible leader.
As Jess said, we recorded that discussion a few hours before the formal announcement, which confirmed not only Chris Wormald's departure as Cabinet Secretary, but what will happen next. We now know the Prime Minister did not make an immediate appointment to succeed Wormald, but instead has split the Cabinet Secretary role on an interim basis between Antonia Romeo, currently Perm Sec at the Home Office, James Bowler, Perm Sec at the Treasury, and Kat Little, Cabinet Office Permanent Secretary and Civil Service Chief Operating Officer. We don't know what process Starmer will use to make a permanent appointment, nor how expedited that process may or may not be. The shocking treatment and departure of Chris Wormald has attracted understandable media interest and widespread criticism from constitutional experts and former government ministers, through former senior officials, civil service unions, even a former cabinet secretary. Lord Gus O'Donnell this morning described the habit of briefing against officials as shabby and called on the Prime Minister to get a grip on his advisers. And Wormald hasn't been the only departure from the top of the civil service this week. On Monday, we reported that Peter Schofield would be stepping down as Permanent Secretary at the Department for Work and Pensions, a post he's held for 8 years. So we can expect to see a bit of change in the Perm Sec cadre over the next weeks and months. It's a moment, as Hannah said, of opportunity or challenge to get a grip with some of the long-standing issues that have been facing civil servants and the civil service. That requires, as she said, visible leadership from the top of the civil service, but it also requires commitment and prioritisation from the political leadership of this government, who face the challenge now of rebuilding a relationship with the civil service which has reached, according to the FDA union, a new low following the dismissal of Wormald. Here at Civil Service World, we'll be following all of this, reporting on the moves, the announcements, the reforms and the policies which impact civil servants' working lives. If you're not already, do subscribe to the podcast so that you never miss an episode. And if even that isn't enough civil service news and insight for you, head over to civilserviceworld.com where you can subscribe to our daily newsletter. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.